I want to talk and focus a little bit on the domestic, and that's because I have for many years had a bit of an obsession about domesticity in the 20th century, in theory rather than, as my long-suffering husband will say, rather than in practice, but I'm fascinated by the sort of myth that we have of the way in which things changed in both world wars, and actually the way in which following both world wars we have a heyday of domesticity actually. And at one level we can look at this in terms of things that happened after the war, in terms of the recession in the interwar period, but I would suggest that we need to look actually back into the war and understand the legacy in terms of its sort of history. So what I would suggest is that nowadays we have a certain number of images, very familiar images from the First World War. The munitions worker we have up there, the VAD, the Land Army girl. Those are ones from Worcestershire, all of which we have seen quite a lot of. And we do see a lot of, partly because the Imperial War Museum made the decision towards the end of the war to photograph all of these, whereas probably you have seen very few images of women standing in food queues, for instance. I have one. Yeah? So there are issues to do with sources, but despite those images that we have, the majority of women in the First World War were housewives. They didn't work. They remained as housewives. Some of the ones who did other things were also housewives. And of course, throughout the war, what's that playing around doing? The largest industry, largest employer of women was always domestic service. Okay? The majority of them were in the home. And so what I want to get you to think about a little bit, or encourage people to think about, are the way in which sort of ideas, experiences, responsibilities of domestic life were sort of stretched and reworked and challenged and shifted round in wartime, as I would argue they were. Now, right from the beginning of the war, the domestic women had that sort of sense of what should we be doing? And this is just very classic. You can pick up any local newspaper and see similar things. So within sort of 4 days, the Worcester Daily Times is saying, now that this dreaded hour has arrived, our country's been asked to take its path in terrible war, which may devastate Europe. We women have to think how we can best aid our soldiers at the front, the families at home. The families at home is important. And there is much we can do, and some things we should certainly refrain from doing. What they should refrain from doing, as we discover, is hoarding food. Because they hoarded food big time, and the wealthier they were, the more they hoarded food, I have to say. And that was reacted to in various different ways. It shot the prices up within the first day of war, as you probably know. And I would want to sort of get rid of any notion that domestic women are either passive or subservient. There is a lovely story, for instance, on the very first day of a shop in Bermondsey in London, where a woman goes in to discover that the price of oats and the price of syrup has gone up significantly from only 2 days before, and she throws her money back on the counter in disgust, walks out and comes back in with 30 of her mates, who then spend the next half an hour pulling everything off the shelves and making chaos until the police are called. She's not going to have it. And I think it's a really nice story, and just sort of gives that sense right at the beginning that they were not so subservient. Now, what I would suggest to you is that the idea of domestic caring extends, and this is one of the things that's quite strange about the war and why there is so much of a focus on domesticity afterwards. They not only have to look after their own family within the home, women, but they're looking after billeted soldiers, depending on where they are. Obviously, if I look at somewhere like Worcestershire or Lichfield or what have you, where there are very military garrison areas, lots of them are looking after refugees to greater or lesser extents. They move to the point of either looking after wounded soldiers in local voluntary convalescent hospitals, or doing various bits and pieces to support them. And then as time goes on, they're looking after relations who are escaping from the bombing, and this goes across all sort of sectors. So, you know, very quickly you have the local newspapers in the areas around here full of how they're coping with the refugees, who's taking them in. I would have to say that when you dig down in some of these, their warm domestic let's look after everyone seems to pale quite quickly. Okay, sort of 6 months on, they're getting really quite bad-tempered, and no, we don't really want to look after them. This is really not appreciated, this shift over from one system to another. So it looked beautiful this morning, it does now, does not. They also extend the caring role outside the home in various different ways, doing this sort of domestic mothering and in other ways. So there are 18,000 charities set up during the war. I love that figure. At one point, there is one charity for every 100 injured soldiers, which is sort of interesting if you think about it. And they are all varied and complicated. Here you have the classic Red Cross. These are ladies in Worcester spending the afternoon doing bandages. Here, they're raising money for the local hospital. There are 3,000 people attending a whist drive in order to raise funds. The whist drive having been arranged by the women. And here you have the Central Prisoner of War Fund, where there is another very classic one. So they get involved in all sorts of charitable activities. But they're charitable activities which I would argue are an extension of their domestic role and which frame their domestic role. This, again, very classic one you may be aware of, it's one of my favourites, is the National Egg Collection, which gets going in a big way from 1915, 1916 onwards. The idea that either, if you, as many women did, you've got chickens and hens and things yourself, you give some of your eggs to go to wounded soldiers, cracked, and they go in this country, whole, and they're shipped off to France and their hospitals over there. The egg collecting is done by children, by women, by schools and what have you. This is one of the really classic images and posters of it. This is one that we unearthed in Much Wenlock of, you wouldn't want to get on the wrong side, one or two of those ladies, collecting in the market stall. And this is the badges that and medals they were given afterwards. If you hadn't got chickens, you were supposed to use less eggs and therefore donate your eggs. And all across the country, there were thousands of these places for collecting, from Harrods to markets like that. And I think it's really interesting if you think it through, because it means that even when you're doing something like cooking a cake for tea, you have to think of it. It becomes a national issue. Does that make sense? You don't use an egg because the egg's got to go to the wounded soldier. And that's why you get the famous eggless sponge, which some of the Heritage Lottery Fund groups that I work with are apt to persecute people with, really, in order to get them into war. Obviously, you know, the biggest one is the Red Cross. And large numbers of them are working for and around and with the Red Cross, either with these wonderful things like jumble sales, endless jumble sales and so forth, but also in a very classic sort of heroic feminine ideal of domestic, but domestic spread out. And they were doing it. So when you've got, for instance, in Evesham, we discovered a hospital there, convalescent hospital, you've got various women are volunteering to help, then you've got people in the area going one step further. So when women come to visit their husbands, their sons who've been injured, women in the local area put them up so that they can stay and visit them. So it's others are going in just to visit every day or taking in food and what have you. So it is this expanding notion of domestic skills, and a way in which the domestic skills that women have are put into this national war effort in quite a sort of excessive way. The knitting comforts for men at land and sea is a real classic one, and these are really nice. I like them from the Liverpool, I think it's from the Liverpool Museum. So this is an invitation to come and do a sock shower party where they're all going to knit en masse. They like to knit and sew en masse. And that, if you think about it, is really quite interesting, because it is that way in which it can actually be leisure. But on the other hand, you're doing something that's for the national war effort. Does that make sense? It's the stitch and bitch of its era, if that makes sense. You're getting comfort, you're getting, you know, a chat and a gossip and so forth. This is not to be knocked. This is the tape measure and measuring thing, because actually they were, how shall we put it? People got into knitting whether they were confident at it or not. So we have all these stories of, you know, mismatched and unshapen socks and mittens and gloves and what have you. We have them going to the wrong places. So some men are throwing away socks after one wearing. They've got so many of them, and others can't get socks for love nor money. And eventually, not surprisingly, it gets pulled under control. Just a real classic of it is the Mayoress of Worcester arranges a comfort day for the soldiers. She's going to centralise and prioritise activities, and that centralisation creeps in all over the place around the provision of mittens. And she has decided that in this one day in December in 1914, they will produce 3,000 mittens in Worcester. They will either get together and knit them, they'll pay other people to knit them. They come to the guild hall together, they hand them in, and the idea is that every one of the local soldiers will have nice warm hands when he goes off to the front. And it was particularly cold, it has to be said, in 1914. But it interests me because this is actually about domesticity being hyped up, if that makes sense. You don't just care for your family, you care beyond it for all these other people. And it gets a sort of national profile. And this is a real, you know, classic. They did talk about, for quite a long time afterwards, this sort of euphemism that men went to war and women knitted. And it's a bit harsh, but certainly it's this way that domestic skills become part of women's domestic role, but extended domestic role. And there's a classic postcard, each stitch a smile, each loop a prayer, making love's armour for brave lads to wear. It's a little bit over the top, I admit, but it gets that sort of ethos that's trying to go out there, that actually you're looking after men, either yours or somebody else's, at a distance. You're continuing your domestic caring role, even if men aren't actually in front of you. Now that's about knitting comforts, it's about charities, but it's also about the process of writing and sending parcels, which is a huge task. And it's about the emotional and the practical support of men who are at the front. We have examples of women who are writing every single day to their husbands. We have them writing to 4 or 5 different sons once a week. This is a massive task at this point in time. But each of them, they're reminding people they're not forgotten, but they're also sending them very practical things. At this point in time, they need food, particularly in the first few months when, frankly, it's also disorganized, that they are short of food. They send out a number of things, some more successfully than others. So there are lovely narratives and bits in letters saying, you know, I don't know what that red sludgy mess was. I think it was strawberries, but it didn't travel very well. You get bread that gets nibbled by rats. On the other hand, fruit cake and cherries, this is much more popular. But it's also about really mundane bits and pieces that are needed. It's about socks and shoes and mirrors and what have you, because they get lost and so forth. This goes for when men go into training and when they go at the front. A lovely bit in Sylvia Pankhurst's Home Front book, which is a really fascinating read, where she describes this woman whose husband has gone off to training in the first few weeks of the war, and she gets herself massively in debt because she realizes he's going off to training and he really doesn't have very good underwear, so she kits him out with new underwear and is consequently in debt as a result of it. But it is that sense, even though he's at a distance, I've got to be caring for him. And it goes right on. Now this is, at one level, it's about people and their families, their sons, their sisters, their brothers, you know, their sons, their husbands, what have you. But it's not necessarily, there's this lovely collection in Staffordshire Archives for this lady, Lois in Stone, who wrote to several young men. Quite what the relationship they imagined they were going to have with her after the war is, we're still left wondering. But we have, she obviously considered it her war work to support all these different men at the front, but also to send them various bits and pieces. So there's lovely bits in here about how he remembers, you know, thanks her for the macaroons, because they're this lovely treat. He remembers her cooking bread at home when he'd visited her. And there is this sense that the domestic ideal becomes really important to him. It becomes so important that a large number of women are following a newspaper adverts, are writing to men who haven't got anyone writing to them. If that makes sense. Again, it's that war work, that everybody should have parcels, everybody should have things sent to them, everybody should be domestically cared for. Obviously, chocolate, cigarettes, and those things are very important. This one really fascinates me because it's I have 3 boys, they're big, so now, but it does touch my heartstrings. This is Will Brown in Worcester, and he joined up at 17, and we see the letters, we have them all, and we see them when he's saying, you know, they're going to send me home because I'm underage, they're going to send me home, I think I'm going to be doing recruiting. The next one says, I'm on a boat to Malta, and you think, okay. That one moved its way rather quickly through. Now, actually, he's very much a working class lad, but his writing is really not that bad. But here you have him writing back to his mum to ask to be sent a handkerchief, because he says, I want you to try and send me a handkerchief, as we can't go out when we like, and I want a handkerchief bad. And it is that sort of sense that he's only 18, 17, 18. His mother needs to look after him, even though he's supposedly out there and fighting a war. Now, what I would suggest is that what happens is, in this process of letters, in this process of sending things, is an idealization of the home begins to build up. Many of those on the front, as you do, most of us when we're in a slightly grotty situation, you live in your imagination as much as in the day-to-day. And they begin to idealise the home. And it's an idealisation which is obviously sort of dug away at by posters and stuff that are produced. And yet, for those women at the home, as the time goes on, things are getting much more difficult. This ideal that people think they're living is really not so good. There are enormous financial problems, some with residual debts. So if when your guy signs up, you were already in debt, as was not uncommon if you're a working class family at that point in time, this could tip you over the edge, if that makes sense. Separation allowances were very slow being paid in many areas. Until you get the Ministry of Pensions set up in 1916, it's very haphazard, and it's very moralistic. The separation allowances go through a number of charities with quite middle-class do-gooding people. There's a lovely bit in that wonderful oral history, The Dillon, when his wife, Cal, who's got about 8 children, it has to be said, turns up to get her separation allowance. And the guy behind the counter sort of, you know, is horrified by this and asks her if all the children are her husband's. And so she socks him one. And it's interesting because he then takes her to court for assault. And the judge won't have it. He says, no, you shouldn't have asked her that way. You should have been very different in your attitude to her. And it's interesting because once they get the separation allowance, they're better off than they ever have been. But that is not the common situation. We've also got people losing their houses and so forth as a result of it coming through so slowly. And this is just a classic example. These are they're lining up. This is one we've got on the website, lining up waiting for their separation allowance, and they're all wearing the men's caps, which is why I quite like that. A sort of, you know, a symbol of where they're at. The other thing is that you must remember is that home is getting more difficult because for the first time war threatens civilians. And this is a very different thing in the imagination, if that makes sense, as much as in the reality. Many people are not going to experience bombing. That's certainly true, but many people, as the war progresses, are going to see images of bombing because they come into the newspapers, they're talked about. People see the home as absolutely threatened. And this one's from London, this one's from Burton-on-Trent, which got one bomb, which killed some pigs and various other things, but it was a real physical manifestation of threat, if that makes sense, and lack of security. And it brought with it, you know, this fear of fascination for the Zeppelins. You get people taking their children out to see them, but at the other hand, absolutely hysterical and discussion as to whether people did or didn't, you know, suffer emotional trauma as a result of it. And of course it is used, the Zeppelins and the shelling of civilians at Whitby very early in 1916 as a rationale for the war. But it also brings about, you know, real impositions into their lives. The blackout is a real hassle. Birmingham is really efficient at the blackout, and they keep going for ages, and they're quite full of themselves, aren't they, about it? We've done it efficiently, that's why we're not having any bombs. Some other places are doing blackout for years with not so much as a sign of a bomb. And so we have Evesham really pissed off, put bluntly, by about 1917 with the line that no one's going to drop a bomb on us, please could we stop all this now? And then they're accused of being unpatriotic. But to people on the ground, it was again, one, the threat to the home, but it was also this huge inconvenience. The biggest problem for people in the home and the housewives in the home was food. Price rises, which go up in the first couple of years by really quite a lot, sort of 30–50%, and food shortages. As you probably know, prior to the First World War, we are importing about 60–70% of our wheat, and wheat produces bread, which is the staple food of the working class. We're also importing about 60–65% of our sugar from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which comes, as you can imagine, to rather a large halt. So there are certain foodstuffs which are vitally important and which get restricted. Now, it begins with these encouragements to people not to consume so much bread, particularly the middle classes are asked not to consume bread because it's needed for the working classes. And you have this sort of, I mean, it's a rather extreme image of the U-boat behind the woman who's carving the loaf, others which are just more straightforward, just eat less bread. It does get extremely heated. You have a sense that people should eat more vegetables, you have all sorts of pressure put on, and at the same time you have this encouragement of everybody to grow more. And that's about the cottage garden, the allotment. It's about actually, in the way in which domesticity was shared out before the war, if your husband's gone to war, now you have to take over a number of his roles, if that makes sense. It may be in his small business, but it may be in terms of eating and growing more vegetables. And we have some really nice examples of it in terms of things like salting the pig. Let's see if we can find it in this Jack from Tenbury Wells in Worcestershire. He's a married man, he's got one daughter, another one on the way when he goes off to war in 1915, and his early letters make it really clear that he's worried about these extra tasks that his wife will have to take on. Who will sharpen the carving knife when he's away? By December 1915 he's really concerned. It's not got it wrong right. He says, so sorry to think of you salting the pig without me there. Do be careful not to slip on the cellar steps, but it's going to pay really very well. And actually, if you think of it, a pig is a really large item. If you are dealing with that on your own, it is a major change to the things that you're expected to do. We unfortunately don't, of course, have the letters back. We don't know whether she successfully did it. It begins with encouragement and instruction and demonstrations and lectures and sort of come on, have the Win the Water cookbook, have the, the demonstration in Kidderminster Hall, have the various things that are going to tell you about it and keep telling people, save wheat, help the fleet, so forth, let's avoid importing. It gets trickier, it has to be said. You begin to get, from 1916, food control committees, food saving committees, sometimes women are on these, but not always, which are beginning to say what should be consumed, what you ought to be doing, trying to voluntarily get people not to overproduce or not to over-consume in terms of food. And some of the ideas around, I have to say, are more extreme than others. You haven't started the war before you get the very extreme one written in, and it's not the only paper I found it in Worcestershire, where somebody's saying, well, the working class are just going to have to chew for longer, then they won't be so hungry. And you're like, you actually felt okay saying that, and you weren't embarrassed about it? 1917, of course, you get the King's Proclamation in all the churches telling people to eat less bread. Oh, these have gone so wrong. They were just beautiful this morning. Horrible. You get this sense that everybody, particularly in rural areas, has to contribute to the food production preservation, that there is a blurring of the idea of the household as a space of consumption and their household as a space of production. Does that make sense? It gets very, very blurred in people's minds. What you should have here is this lovely bit from the Coventry Evening Standard, which talks about, how incredibly valuable the housewife is, and nobody realised it until the war, because they realised that the rural housewife could grow in the garden, in the allotment, lots of food, and she needed to do that work, and they were going to be there to support it. And of course you have the young children who are out picking things like, in this case it's blackberries, to make jam for the soldiers in 1917. That's Central School in Worcester. So everybody has to get involved in it. One of the ways they try and encourage this to happen is through the setting up of all sorts of women's organisations, or promoting it through women's organisations. The formation of the WI movement in 1915 is about food production. That is what it's for. It's about ensuring that more food will be produced, more food will be preserved, that food that one person is producing in glut will be able to be sold to somebody else, so that there are little markets set up whereby you can take your spare allotment, your spare garden food to sell it. The first one is in Wales, next one is down in near Chichester in Sussex, but Worcestershire is the third county to come on in 1916, producing it, with Pershore being a classic, one of the very first ones. Yes, they're about preservation. Any food that is there should be preserved, but of course with the shortage of sugar, that becomes actually quite problematic. There are some wonderful recipes that the local WI have promised to try out for me, where you will preserve using salt instead of sugar, and they guarantee us, according to Mrs. Peel, who wrote and was employed by the Minister of Food at the time, the taste apparently goes away after a few weeks. I'm not convinced, but the WI have promised, as part of their Heritage Lottery Fund bid, to make this jam and try it out and see how it works in practice. Anything that you think now about the WI, remove from your mind. This was a cross class rural organisation where all sorts of different people joined it. It was an organisation which was democratic. It had secret ballots at a point when you actually could not have a secret ballot for a parish council election. It had a very strong line that it was not going to be party political, but it was itself very political. It was going to be open to everyone of whatever religion, whatever party, and that's why it becomes very important in peace work. Is involved with Wolf and what have you in the interwar period, because it believes that it wants to promote peace, and it will not do anything direct towards the war, at least theoretically. It does a lot of pig and rabbit clubs. Rabbit clubs are to help people, as you would imagine, look after rabbits and what have you. The pig clubs are a sort of insurance, so that if you've got one family pig and it dies, if you've been paying into the pig club, it gets replaced out of that pig club money. Does that make sense? Which is sort of important if that's your one family pig. They also do a lot of toy making and markets. The toy making is really important because we've been importing masses of toys from Germany prior to the war, and they make a really big thing about how well made these toys are and how they're not like the shoddy things we were importing from Germany beforehand. But they're also important because they're a way of providing money that you can earn for women in rural areas. So we do get descriptions of women earning as much as 10 shillings a week, which is quite a lot actually for a rural woman at that time, as extra from home. Now, this tension about food goes from a sort of pressure and encouragement to a level of hectoring around the King's proclamation, and a level of threat, and a level that's really quite aggressive. So by 1917, you are looking at serious fines for wasting bread. I mean, £5 is an awful lot of money. £25, £50 is huge amounts of money to people. But these are the sorts of prosecutions that are beginning to come in by the time you hit 1917. And it's interesting the language that's used. The housewife's trench is the cupboard. And they've got this sense that women should do it, but also there is a real threat. And this threat gets quite, I want to take that one back a bit, gets quite aggressive. So we have, for instance, in Kidderminster, the banning of Sunday school outings because children will waste bread. We have women told not to attack the loaf in the middle of the morning at 11s because it's wasting bread. You get a really quite aggressive tone before you finally bring in rationing in 1918, but the rationing is not for bread. Like in the Second World War, rationing bread is considered to be, in terms of morale, too negative. So instead, it's about meat, it's about fats, and cheese, and so forth. But by that time, people are spending hours in food queues, and this is a potato queue in Worcester, and it's a long one. Actually, we've only got a little bit of it. They take literally hours in it. We found in the school logbooks in Staffordshire that they are, I mean, we've got an example of Worcester of 6 hours to get a tub of margarine at one point, 1916-17. In Staffordshire, they're hauling their kids out of school to stand them, which I think is wonderful, stand them in the food queue so that, they won't have to spend, as housewives, 6 hours in the food queue because they've got other things to do. So the food queue is quite extreme. The meat rationing does begin to come in, and fats and so forth, as you reach 1918. Now, that sort of domestic caring, that tension created, and it does increasingly become tension if you've tried out some of the First World War recipes. Some of them are quite intensive in terms of labour, the scrabbling around for food, the worry about finance and what have you, is also framed by the anxiety and tension around loved ones, around husbands, around sweethearts, around children. And this is one sort of example. It should be 1918, they're in the National Armouries, this collection, and because it's really unusual to get male and female, you've got both sides of it, the wives' letters there as well. But by 1918, rather 1914, she's not heard from him for a number of years. They've got 3 children. She's living with her mother by this point in time, but she's desperate. She keeps writing. He's reported missing. She's in this sort of no man's land of uncertainty. And she talks about, I feel I must keep writing. I trust you'll get the letters. If I get word, I will be most thankful. I think that I must still have hope. That all is well. I don't know how I should bear it. I have my information that you're wounded from the hospital. That's all she knows. My heart feels almost broken, and I pray for a word of assurance. And she talks about the children wanting their daddy very badly. Unfortunately, it takes till 1919 before she knows that he's dead. We have very, very little that tells us about the response of women when they hear that their children or their husbands are dead. This is Lavinia Talbot, who is obviously quite a wealthy lady. She's married to the Bishop of Winchester, and she has 5 children. Her youngest is born about 8 years after the others. And this is what she records the day that she hears that her youngest son has died. And I just find it heart-rending. Neville is one of her other sons. Gilbert is the one who dies. And she says, she talks about a very anxious letter from Neville telling of terrible fighting, attack and counterattack at Hooge. No news of Gilbert. Almost at the same moment, I saw Ted, that's her other son who's at home, reading something near the door, and it made me sure there was bad news. I went up to him and asked what it was, and after hesitating, he let me see the paper, which told me my darling Gilbert being killed, and I knew that most of the light of my life had gone out. And it's heart-rending. Again, you can come back to, in the diaries, the terrible handwriting, but you can come back to when she talks about it and is traumatized by it, and then when the peace comes and how she feels on the day of peace, because she knows that she's lost her beloved youngest son. On the other hand, we don't have the news of how young Will Brown, whose mum sent him a handkerchief, felt. But she lost him in 1918, at 1916 on the Somme, when he was still only barely 19 years old. So it's framed by that sort of thing. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We've got time for a couple of questions.
Okay.
All of these things that you mentioned about the domestic thing, is that a fact to the well-affluent people?
Is that?
Affect to affluent, more affluent people? It seems like working.
No, it goes right across everybody. The domestic thing, this idea that the charities are just the well-off doing it. No, it's right the way across. The writing, the charities, the caring, the predominantly domestic is the experience right the way across. I mean, although we often think about war as if it's the same experience across the country and as if women have the same experience. But of course it's very different according to your age and where you are, if you're rural, if you're urban, if you've already got 3 children or not. There are some areas where married women work, but the women who are working are the unmarried young ones who are skipping out of domestic service to do so. The ones who are domestic are the predominant, and it really is the majority of them, are working class women. They're the ones with real food shortages and queues and what have you. If you're really wealthy, you send your servants to do the queue. But the working class women are absolutely suffering, but they are, writing, caring, sending things. Even when they haven't got enough food at home, they are sending food off and clothes off to their husbands, their sons, in training or on the front. I mean, the problem is that in training, they're almost struggling as much. It is easier to get evidence of the emotions at the time from the wealthier women, because like Lavinia, I mean, they're the ones who have the time to write, and the wherewithal and the cost to write. You have to dig around much more to find out bits and pieces about the working class women and how they felt. But we do keep finding these little tiny bits of evidence. But it is it's a real dig, if that makes sense. And the organisations that get set up, which knit or the WI or what have you, are absolutely cross-class, and it's a really big time for women's organisation. The Women's Co-op Guild, for instance, which publishes its maternity letters in 1915, is very much a working class organisation. Yeah.
So I'm very interested about the banning of the Sunday school outing. I didn't catch where it was.
It was Kidderminster, bless it. But I mean, it's only Kidderminster, and this is the serendipity of evidence. It's only Kidderminster because somebody, bless them, in Kidderminster cut out lots of things from the War Saving Committee, so we have a really good scrapbook of it, which you can go right in and look at. But it's which records the discussions in the meetings, as I say, when they decide, no, we're not having Sunday school outings. And there was a lengthy discussion about, well, what should we have and where should we stop it, and should we allow people to have bread for this? Should we allow people to take sandwiches to work? Well, maybe they probably will eat the sandwiches. On the other hand, children, it's considered, will be wasteful.
Because what I'm curious is, what's sort of the definition of wasting bread? Is it
absolutely.
With the crust, shock horror, or is it that they'll eat more than they need to, kind of thing? That if you really only need 2 sandwiches, if you take 4, is that too much? What's that definition?
That's definitely, the definition is hard to get to, but there are various bits. So if you are giving, if you're throwing out bread, so you shouldn't have let your bread get stale and thrown it out, or if you're feeding it to your pig, because you're pick and eat acorns and things, then that's definitely and clearly identified as waste. But yes, you eating too much, it's hard to check. Though we have found indications that in some places they're very tight about the size of a loaf, and it got like grottier and greyer. As you can imagine, as the war progressed and they had to put other stuff in it and what have you. But we seem to have indications that they were instructing the bakers not to sell them immediately, that you held on to them for so many hours. Because, well, you know what fresh bread's like. You can cut it much thinner and you can, you know, eat it less determinedly if it's not quite so fresh.
Do you do barley at home? Is that why loads of things are made from barley? Because loads of recipes we came across, you know, barley muffins, barley everything.
Yes, and potatoes. Though there's a bit of a potato crisis at a certain point because the crop goes wrong, and at one point they're getting them in from Canada, but people are encouraged to grow their own potatoes, and they're being given out potato seed. So we can find in Pershore that the WI and the Food Savings Committee are both handing out potatoes for people to go, you know, potato seeds, go dig them into your back garden and what have you. So yes, you get some rather strange things made with potatoes, barley, anything rather than the wheat that comes from the American prairies. I mean, there is a shift in terms of agriculture. They say force farmers to, you know, grow more wheat and stuff, but it really cannot do it, you know, in terms of the amounts that we've been producing beforehand. And we got into the same mess all over again for the Second World War.
Yeah, well, that's right. But they got onto it much more quickly in the Second World War.
Yes, they did.
Didn't they? Because they knew that there were going to be the blockades of the ships bringing supplies in. Whereas in the First World War, you know, sort of it was quite a shock, I think, wasn't it?
They do seem to have been remarkably surprised. So in the Second World War, they forgot to stockpile fertiliser, which all came from abroad, which was not a bright, you know, and it's easy to stockpile, and they didn't. And then they went, oh, look, it's not as productive. So it's remarkable how slow they are, but you're quite right. They knew what they were doing with rationing and various other things, and, you know, and got moving, and they were much more efficient with their use of prisoners of war. It takes them quite a while to use prisoners of war. They begin to get them in 1916 to get them to do agricultural work. The Vale of Evesham is one of the first places where they do it because market gardens are so intense on labour. So they get them there very, very quickly. Whereas the Second World War, they seem to have, you know, okay, what we do is use prisoners of war and things as well as.
Because the stories I've been told by farmers, not who were actually in the First World War, but who were reflecting on what they remember hearing from their parents and grandparents, was that, of course, the horses were taken away in huge numbers in World War I, which at the same time as the government was telling everybody they'd got to plough up pasture land in order to grow food. And, you know, sort of the problems that they went through. There's a wonderful picture of an elephant that was actually
used an elephant. There's a car with a plough behind, a sort of Ford car with a thing behind it. Though it is a little, I'm always worried about the war horse effect here. I mean, they did take, you know, horses, definitely, but they didn't take them under and over certain sizes and certain ages and what have you. And large numbers of farmers and market gardeners and people were not actually using horses because they couldn't afford them. And then the war agricultural committees in the counties, you know, would have horses that were loaned out, as they had tractors that were loaned out.
They were going to get their act together, wouldn't they?
Yes, but I mean, you know, the Second World War is more significant in how it changed farming than the first. It goes, in the Second World War, they talk about it moved from dog and stick farming to mechanisation by the end of the Second World War. In the First World War,
there were very few tractors and most
very few. We do have some images of them, and I suspect that you talk about the sort of class issues with the Landgar. They will be the trained ones who came through the Farm and Gardens Union. I suspect there were different groupings of agricultural workers, if that makes sense. What they want to do is get women to do it to start with. We have endless discussion in Worcestershire and meetings about trying to get ordinary village women to do the agricultural work. They've always been doing the harvest, whether it's a, you know, pea, plum, what have you, harvest, not just, but they want to get them to do the winter work. They don't want to do the winter work. There's real resistance about doing the winter work. There is an indication that they don't want to do the winter work because they haven't got the right shoes and clothing to do the winter work. And there's a real tension about that. And it's, you know, various different groups get brought in with the farmers. It has to be said, quite resistant. What they want to use is young boys and old men. And it's only in 1917 they bring in the
I wonder if I could ask you to comment on, first of all, the logistics of getting citrus and sugar and rum from the Caribbean to support the metropole.
Yeah.
And because you mentioned some figures about 60% being from Austria and Hungary.
Yeah, the straight sugar was.
Yeah, I just wondered what the percentages were from the Commonwealth and in particular the Caribbean.
Remarkably little, actually, and I couldn't give you the stats because I don't know them. So we're down to, at the beginning, they start off with about 30% of sugar is not from Austria-Hungary. Now, some of that is sugar beet, but we're really slow about sugar beet in this country. The Austria-Hungary sugar we're bringing in is actually sugar beet sugar, if that makes sense. So, I mean, they would have been fine on importing it to begin with, but as the submarine warfare gets more intense, they begin to move back from that. So some will be still coming in and actually trying to get stuff in to support the troops that are in fighting will become increasingly problematic. So once you're hitting 1960, 1970, then you're in real difficulty, giving them what they want.
What about citrus and rum?
Citrus, I suspect rum is fairly the same. Citrus, your real problem is also the preservation, because we're not looking at refrigeration in any sense in the ship. So it's how fast you can get it right across without any problems. But I couldn't tell you the stats, I'm afraid. But yeah, it will be a sort of upward trajectory of it getting worse. Definitely.
When we were in the Imperial War Museum looking at all the kind of housewives' handy books and all the, I mean, I guess so much work was then put into about like slowing, like you said about eating slowly. There was lots about digestion and about making sure everybody has little naps and eating at lunchtime. And I just thought it was really good sound advice, a lot of it, which obviously all got abandoned. Because actually if we were all still using that advice, we'd be so healthy today. It's all stuff we all know about, you know, not eating after 6 o'clock. It was just loads of effort or money went into, I suppose, to writing all these little things. Yeah. But then it all just...
Well, it didn't dissipate because the interwar period was full of really, really heavy advice in those directions. Right. Absolutely, from the radio, from the women's organisations, from the magazines, everywhere. Yeah. But there was a real gap between the advice people were being given and what they could afford. Right. So, you know, you hit nutritionalists like people at sort of King's College who are saying this is what you should be eating, and people are saying don't be ridiculous. You know, what we can basically afford is bread, and we can afford, you know, the meat and then the gravy used for a suet pudding later in the week and what have you. So it's, I mean, there is a real cost issue that comes in afterwards, but they're pushing it even more furiously in the interwar period than they are in the wartime. And they've begun to get scientific management, and they've begun to get nutrition, and it's you know, it's a nightmare. You just feel for the housewives actually barraged by all this. This is what you should do, and this is what you shouldn't do, and this, and then they're trying to make it, you know, on really tiny budgets. And
we found there were lots of things like pamphlets about self-raising flour, which I guess had just been invented or just come. Maybe it puffed everything up. It was the hope that you'll puff it all up.
It was probably produced by the Self-Raising Flour Company as well. There are a lot of adverts trying to promote
all these kind of, you know,
these are the ones that are going to solve the problem. It's a real commercial opportunity
so that
in that direction.
To get going as well, wasn't it?
Yes, and then local newspapers are absolutely full of it, and there's, you know, Win the War cookbooks and what have you.
Really interesting.
But it's, I mean, I can't read it from the first, you know, from the First War. I know there's one or two bits in the Second War where women just talk about feeling guilty all the time, which I think is a really, you know, when I read it, I thought, oh God, that's how I would have felt. That everything you did was sort of, you know, there was that framing which said, well, you shouldn't waste on that, you should be doing this, you should be doing, and it must have actually invaded down. But what it also elevated is this idea of normal, ordinary family life and domestic life and living at home, which is what a lot of them, men and women, desperately wanted, hence the rush to get married at the end of the war and things.
Thank you. Okay. We're over time, so I'm very good.